Welcome everyone. I'm so excited to see you all back here in person. It's been a long time since we've had our Iran Center seminars live. My name is Dan Sheffield. I'm the acting director of the Iran Center since our actual director has gone so far away from us, that is Behrouz Ghamari, who's joining us for this semester. But it's my delight to be here in leading this seminar series this semester. We'll be meeting on a nearly weekly basis with a really exciting schedule of talks. So I really encourage everyone who is interested in Iran or the Persian Gulf world to check out our website to find our event schedule, iran.princeton.edu. But today, to kick off the semester, we have a really exciting event. As you can see, we're joined together today to celebrate the publication of a new and much awaited and very important book. This is a book entitled Celebrating Local Democracy in Iran, State Building and the Politics of Decentralization. We're joined by Kian Tajbakhsh from Columbia University, who has a really unique position as both an observer of the events starting with the beginning of the 20th century and the development of municipal government in Iran, and also as a participant in many of those events. Indeed, as many of us in the room know, someone who has even run into a little bit of trouble owing to his interest in these events as he was living in Iran. So we'll be hearing from Dr. Tajbakhsh in just a moment, who will give us an account of his experiences both in researching the book and in what came to pass thereafter. We only have about an hour for our seminar today, so we've asked Dr. Tajbakhsh to speak for about half of that time, for about half an hour, after which we'll hopefully have a very lively discussion with questions and answers. So I ask everyone who wants to participate in the discussion just to ask a single question and something that is a real question as we begin that conversation. Oftentimes we get these sort of prepared 10-minute monologues, but we're really hoping to have a conversation and not so much of a prolonged, although often very learned comment. So as the talk is going, if anyone wants to get on the queue to ask their questions, please catch my eye and give me a little symbol. I'll get you guys on a list of people that have questions. But without any further ado at all, I'd like to turn the floor over to our distinguished speaker, Kian Tajbakhsh from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tajbakhsh.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction. And first of all, let me express my gratitude and thanks to the Mossavar Center for Iranian Studies and Dr. Behrouz Ghamari Tabrizi, who kindly extended the invitation to me, and all the other members of the department that expressed an interest in this work. I'm going to start with a brief reading from the preface of my book, which gives you a little bit of background about the personal context which led me to write this book. In the summer of 1998, I visited Tehran, the city of my birth and early childhood. My memories of the city were somewhat hazy because I had been out of the country since childhood, doing my schooling in the UK. But when I came back to Tehran, I fell in love with the city in a particularly nerdy and weird way, and I'll explain that to you. I was in a shared taxi with an urbanist friend of mine, an architect and urban designer, who was pointing out some recent developments in the city as we drove around Tehran. We were squeezed in the front passenger seat, two of us, which used to be the case in Tehran, but no longer, and three men we did not know were in the back. The taxi's radio was playing the live broadcast of the embezzlement trial of Tehran's high-profile and dynamic mayor, Gholamreza Karbozchi, who many urbanists saw as the Robert Moses of Tehran, referring to the New York urbanist czar, because of his forceful urban renewal policies. Most people I had spoken to in the city believed his defense, Karabasji's defense, which we were listening to on the radio, that the trial was a political retribution for his role in helping the reformists achieve national political power, Mohammad Khatami's administration. But our taxi driver apparently did not. Listening to our conversation, suddenly he said in disgust, "That Karabasji, he's lining his pockets just like all the others. He's a crook. What has he done for this city? Absolutely nothing." A few minutes later, we broke through some gnarled traffic. Here is gnarled traffic, which unfortunately still exists, but imagine this was the kind of road we were on. We broke through some gnarled traffic in Tehran and entered a wide urban expressway, winding down around several small hills, all bright green, full of flower beds, sprinklers busy, a big clock sculpted onto the face of the hill with rocks and plants. My urbanist friend identified it as a brand new road system that had connected two parts of the city and eased the traffic flow considerably. He said almost all urban redevelopment in the city over the past several years had landscaping equally beautiful. On hearing this, the same taxi driver broke in again. "Are you kidding me? That Karabasji is a genius. I should know. I drive all day. Before him, the city was a mess. It was unlivable. All these roads are great, and the city has turned a new leaf." The combination of the vista and the cab driver's 180-degree turn fascinated me as a scholar and thrilled me as a visitor to the city. It may seem like a strange, nerdy way to fall in love, but the core of the study of local politics, I'm trained as an urbanist and a political scientist, the core of the study of local politics is investigating the way local institutions succeed or fail to respond to what their residents want, and conversely, how ordinary people assess their local government institutions and engage with them, or don't engage with them. I had just witnessed, as a scholar, an episode that encompassed all these elements in this little cab. It was an enticing intellectual puzzle for me. I also knew that Iran was at the cusp of a novel, indeed improbable, democratic experiment in a unique ideological context. I'll give you one other example as I visited Iran after a 20-year absence. This was the summer after a 20-year absence. We visited the largest park in the city, Park Millat, one day late in the evening on a balmy summer evening. I was enthralled by the easy pleasure of this public scene in the middle of a huge metropolis. The specter of large families openly enjoying the social amenities, substantially free from violence and litter, clashed in my mind with Iran's political restrictions. The openness and solidarity of the social world contradicted the closed and restricted space of the political world. This was another intellectual puzzle for me. How, I wondered, did these two dimensions of the public sphere interact to shape the city, the broader society, and the everyday life of Iranians? This question took hold of me and motivated me to think of ways of returning in order to research so I might understand. Now, experiencing such a novel situation hardly itself justifies relocating to Iran, which is what I eventually did. But it formed part of the intellectual enigma that spurred my resolve to return to Iran. I was teaching at the New School for Social Research at the time, and so I needed to find a way to find a research topic to get back to Iran. To make the longer visit, I needed such a research topic, and I had been there for 3 weeks when I found it. An article in the Reformist newspaper reported that President Mohammad Khatami's administration was planning elections in the following year, 1999, for what would become the first city and village elected councils throughout the entire country. So effectively, for the first time in Iranian history, elected local government would be created and established. To me, it seemed as if the resurgence of city life after the end of the 10-year Iran-Iraq war, expressed in these beautiful flowers and people wanting to go out and experience family life and social life, it seemed as if the resurgence of city life after the end of the 10-year Iran-Iraq war had paved the way for a more political expression of public desire. The reformists had grabbed the imagination of the country, indeed the world, with their bold project of democratic Islamism. They called for strengthening civil society, freedom of speech in the press, and greater individual freedoms. Now, with this new institutional reform, they intended to broaden and deepen political participation through a far-reaching institutional design of the state system, establishing elected local government throughout the whole country in every city, town, and village. Over 1,000 cities and over 35,000 villages overnight were now going to be governed through elected institutions, local elected institutions. The reformists, when they promoted this platform, expressed great ambitions for what political scientists call political decentralization. Local elections, they claimed, would help bring some form of local democracy in its wake. It would lead to far-reaching transformation of the country's political system in the direction of greater democracy, and they hoped pluralism, accountability, and at any rate, it would invite the residents of Iranian cities and towns to engage with their representative institutions in a way that had not been the case before. For me, it was a research opportunity right in my area of academic specialization, one that I could not pass up. I would be able to study the local political system in Iran as it was born. And for those of you who are social scientists, you know this is a very rare opportunity to be on the ground at the beginning of a very large reform of a social system. I would be able to be there from the beginning and track it, which is what I planned to do. I dedicated my 10 years of future career to that. Now, I have since realized, remember this is 1999, I have since realized that the door I was walking through, the one bringing in democratic forces and Western thought, had already begun to close. I could not see it then, but the backlash of the regime against domestic pressures for liberalization was in full swing. The regime's counterattack against domestic democratic opposition was well underway by the year 2000. But in 2001, when I first relocated for my sabbatical, I knew none of this. This book tells the story of this ambitious chapter of the reformist movement under the Islamic Republic of Iran and its subsequent fate after the defeat of the most democratizing elements of the reform movement. It examines the origins of the reform and how they were established in law and how they were fought over by different interest groups and different factions within the Iranian political scene. The book aims to provide as comprehensive a picture of the local government sector as is possible under current political conditions, where direct access to the institutions studied here remains difficult for independent researchers. This is the first book to analyze the local government and intergovernmental sectors, the whole public administration system, in Iran in the context of studies of state building, democratization, and authoritarianism. And given the difficulties of access to data for independent researchers, it might, unfortunately, remain so for some time. That is the background to, that's a selection from the preface. And what I thought I would do is, in the next 10, 15 minutes, provide some of the key highlights and basic arguments of the book. And I will try to stay away from some of the more academic and scholarly dimensions, which I'm happy to discuss in the question and answer period. So the basic story the book tells, I've touched on it briefly now, is that in 1999, the Islamic Republic of Iran undertakes what could be called a Big Bang transformation of the state system. I'm sorry for the text. I was going to clean it up. I forgot to do it. Okay. But too much text on the slides. But I'll just give the highlights. So in 1999, the state system undergoes a massive transformation, the most important transformation of the governmental state system in Iran since 1979. And this massive expansion of the electoral machinery of the regime, bringing in tens of thousands of potential voters, right? So around the entire country, tens of thousands of voters, even, maybe leaving up to 100,000 posts were created, and this is an expansion of the electoral machinery. The question, one of the questions the book tries to answer is, given the closed and illiberal nature of the regime in Iran, why did they do it? So as a political scientist, one of the questions is, if a political system is claiming not to be democratic in the way in which it's defined in the West, why would they risk expanding these kinds of institutions, which could potentially give opposition forces opportunities to mobilize and use institutions against the monopoly power of the state? So that's a conundrum. The book tries to grapple with this and provides an answer to this question. The book also touches on the global context in the late 1990s, let us say the 1980s to the 1990s. Iran was not the only country that undertook this kind of decentralization reform. It turned out to be a global fad. It turned out to be what, actually I think Mary Lee Grindle was at Princeton at the time, as a Princeton scholar wrote in her book, the Decentralization Revolution. That is to say, many countries around the world were undertaking these kinds of decentralized reforms, which means essentially pushing down political authority, financial authority, administrative responsibilities to lower levels of the government, below the central government. That's essentially what. In the case of the United States, decentralization we're a federalist system. Iran is not a federalist system, but in federal systems, we have the federal government, which is the national government, and then you have subnational states, municipalities, counties. The more you push down responsibility to lower levels of lower tiers of the administrative political system, we refer to that as a trend towards decentralization. China undertook this. Indonesia did this. Many other countries did this. So the book tries to touch on some of the comparative aspects of how Iran was different, how it was the same. And I'd be happy to discuss those. I do point out, though, that the Iranian context was unique. It, in fact, had very unique internal domestic reasons why they undertook this, which didn't have much to do with the kind of things that we were seeing in some of the other countries. For example, international organizations such as the UN and World Bank tied a lot of their help, their aid to countries, and told them that they should decentralize because they thought in that way states can become more efficient. That wasn't the case in Iran, and the book tries to trace internal reasons. Now, there was an interesting discovery I made as I started doing the research. When I started looking at the question of the شورای شهر و روستا, شورای اسلامی شهر و روستا, which is the official name, the Islamic Councils of Cities and Villages in Iran, when I started looking at that in 1999, as I said, when I went during the time of the reform, the height of the reform movement, the conventional wisdom was that this reform, which had been implemented by the reformist administration of Muhammad Khatami, had been designed and initiated by them. It was the reformist project of democratization, a way of diluting central power, dispersing power towards smaller and far-flung institutions. That was the conventional wisdom, and I would say, until my book has come out, it is the conventional wisdom. But my book shows that it's not true. And the reason is because when I started looking at the origins of the law which created this change, I found that in fact it did not originate with the reformists at all. It originated several years before in what is known in the literature as a hardline parliament, the fourth parliament from 1992 to 1996, the fourth Majlis. And it was sponsored, the bill, the whole discussion of whether the state should undertake this reform, it was sponsored and advanced by very hardline regime insiders. That was a puzzle. So obviously, the goal of this, if that's the case, then the goal of the reform could not have been liberalization or democratization. The goal must have been something else. The law was passed in 1996, and in the last days of that parliament, it was then implemented by the reformist administration. So that's the sort of that's the one big discovery of the book, and I think what it showed me is that they were different. What it led me to do in the book, in the research, is to look carefully about different motivations that different groups could have for supporting this reform. The reformists obviously had their agenda, but obviously there were other agendas, and that led me to, I'll go back to this, that led me to, that led me to ask why. And the basic answer of why the state decided to give cities and localities more authority or more power was because they were trying to respond, the state was responsive, to the rise of essentially poorly planned and managed cities that had created a lot of grievances amongst the residents who had come into the cities after the war. There was not enough housing, the land was poorly managed, and like places like slum clearance, the local government didn't know what to do, so they would sort of bulldoze people's houses and clear them out, and it led to riots in the first half of the 1990s. Asif Bayat, who is an Iranian sociologist, speaks of street politics. This is one of the instances of street politics. And what happened is that the parliament was responsive to this. They said, well, what can we do in response to this? And the law, my interpretation is, was an attempt to provide some kind of electoral outlet for people to engage and to elect local representatives, but in a way that did not undermine the fundamental assumptions of the Islamic political system. And so what they wanted to do was to create some kind of participation, but strictly within the parameters that is understood and accepted and tolerated by the Islamic system, political system, which doesn't include the kinds of things we refer to as liberalism or liberal freedoms or democratic accountability in the West. But later on in the book, I have a long discussion about the theory of democracy that I'm using, and I'm just flagging this for a broader discussion, maybe in question of answer. I do try to, the book tries to look at the different meanings of democracy as used by Iranian actors, and tries to separate out what the overlaps and contradictions between the conventional meaning of democracy as we use it in the Western democratic tradition. Okay, let me just then move on, and I'll come back to this. I will say, so the book tells the story of the fate, the genesis, the origins, the evolution, and the fate of this experiment in local democracy over a 20-year period, from the time I first went to Iran and studied in 1999 to last year. And it's based on both first-hand and archival and field research and basic data that I've been able to supplement in the last few years, and also as much first-hand data that I can get my hand on from government sources and official sources. So that's the story I tell. I tell it through, you can think about it as a kind of story of a fight between, or not fight, but it's a kind of contention between three main groups in Iran, who each had their idea of what they wanted to do with this, with these new institutions of local politics. The three groups I separate into what I call the Velayi rulers, and Velayi is a term I actually have used. Some people have used the term Khomeinists, but it's so hard to say, Khomeinists, and also in Iran no one uses the term Khomeinists. But the Khomeinists in Iran, they refer to themselves as Velayat Madar or Velayi. And so essentially the core power center in the Iranian political system, which is called the Nizam in Persian or regime in English, are the institutions around the supreme leader. Okay, so this is an unelected, unaccountable, not necessarily unresponsive, but it is a classically unaccountable, unelected monopoly power at the center of the political system. And that has both clerics and non-clerics and lay politicians and the military and so forth in this group. The second group, okay, and their objective was Islamization. Obviously, there are nuances here I'm trying to summarize. So you have the Velayi group, their goal of supporting these new institutions and getting people to participate is Islamization. That is to say, deepening their understanding of what an Islamic public participation would mean. They're not against participation. This is an interesting thing I found, was that they actually support participation, but on the terms that they understand to be tolerable and acceptable within the confines of the constitution and the basic assumptions of the regime. The second group followed an agenda of managerialism, which is to just say bureaucrats and technocrats just wanted this change to happen so they could run the public administration system and run cities more efficiently. Those were technocrats and bureaucrats and some moderate Islamist parties. For those of you who are familiar with the political parties in Iran, the Kargozaran and the Islamic Engineers Association were like important members of this group that were interested in economic efficiency and creating more local economic development so that the young generation could get more jobs, so they wouldn't riot and they would be not so much discontent with the system. But they were not. But then were not interested in liberalism. They weren't interested in liberalization. Let us say. Let's leave aside liberalism. Liberalization, opening out the system to more voices, more pluralism, more tolerance, more freedom of individual freedoms, and so forth. That's the second group. The third group, their agenda was democratization. And this was promoted by, let us say, the avant-garde of the reformist groups, like Hezb Musharikat, the group of what's called the Participation Front, and so forth. Not all the reformists supported such a bold experiment, but this avant-garde group did. So the dramatis personae of this story is how these three groups, over a 20-year period, each pushed their own agendas. And I tell the story of essentially the outcome and conclusions is that 20 years on, the original motivation and design, not of the reformists, but of the original law, has won out. In other words, a combination, an alliance of the Velayi rulers with the moderates and the technocrats, they allied together and have succeeded in putting their stamp on the content and the shape and the performance of these new institutions. They have successfully institutionalized a huge change without threatening the fundamentals of the political system. The Islamic reformists that pushed the democratization agenda have not succeeded. I mean, have failed. And so alongside the national level in which you would say the reformist experiment failed, this was the local dimension of it too. And so rather than, for the reformists, they believed that this massive transformation of the state system, bringing in tens and hundreds of thousands of people to get involved in their everyday life and in their everyday communities and neighborhoods and cities, would challenge what they saw as theocratic, despotic regime. This is the term that is used by the avant-garde of the reformists, istibdad dini. They refer to it as that. Despotic, theocratic regime. They felt that this could be a way of opening that out, you know. But the story I tell is that at the end of 20 years so far, rather than challenge that arrangement, in fact, these new institutions have helped consolidate it and strengthen the regime. And it's done that by, I'll point to, and I'll close in a few minutes, I'll make a few conceptual, very briefly, few conceptual points about a way in which political scientists and political theorists think about state power. You'll see here there are four possible alternatives on two dimensions. These two dimensions of state power can be easily described as power over. There are two types of power. Okay, power over versus power to. And we're referring here to the relationship between states and societies. So states can be strong in two ways. They can have power over society, or they can have power to represent society in its collective decisions. The power over I refer to as despotic power. Power to I refer to, and it's a bit of a jargon, but it's referred to as infrastructural power. All political regimes, democratic or non-democratic, have a combination of these. But as you can see, if despotic power is high, that is to say, the power of states over society is high, but infrastructural power, that is to say, the ability to represent and express and implement collective decisions. A society wants a law to be implemented. It wants welfare provisions. It wants redistribution. It wants the rule of law to be exercised and so forth. It wants things to be enforced. That's infrastructural power, the power to represent and be a voice for society. So if despotic power is high, but the ability of the state to represent collective interests is low, you have a classic autocratic or authoritarian state. And you could refer to maybe the pre-1979 regime in Iran, the Shah's regime, as a sort of autocratic because it had infrastructural power was low. I'll give you an example. I'll give you a very concrete example. I spoke to someone who I knew who used to be a governor of a far-flung Ostan in Iran before the revolution. And he told me the story that he said the Shah was going to come and visit his town, the capital of that Ostan. And he got a visit from the Minister of Water or something, the Minister of Water, saying, we told the Shah that 5 years ago we had plans to bring piped drinking water to all of the city. And he said, so I want you to show me. And they said, but we don't have any piped water. It never happened. And so what they did is actually, he told me, according to him, he said, when they came, they got like just a pipe with a tap, which was just empty, and he would just stick it in the ground. And when the Shah came by, they would look at, he would just say, oh, okay, so I can see the pipes. But they wasn't connected to anything. I can assure you in Iran, there's almost no village without piped water now. So that is the aspect of infrastructural power. It's ability of the state to implement its power throughout the entire country. Now, democratic systems have high infrastructural power and low despotic power, because democratic systems are open to interest groups to have their voice heard. States cannot routinely make decisions without routine negotiation with civil society and interest groups in civil society. That is the sort of a basic feature of democratic systems. States are responsive and interest groups penetrate the state. When you have despotic power, states dominate the state. They can make decisions without routine negotiations with society, civil society groups, so forth. So that was so my argument is that what the reformists were trying to do, what decentralization was about in Iran, was about expanding infrastructural power from low to high. That's the theoretical kind of takeaway here. That's the way I interpret it. They tried to push that. Now, the Velai group and the moderate technocrats also wanted to do that. They all wanted to increase the infrastructural power. What the reformists wanted to do was to decrease despotic power from high to low. And so the story is those two groups are pushing in different directions. The reformists are pushing it to go into this box. The Velai groups are pushing it to go into this box. And my story is the ruling group and the technocrats won. That's the upshot that's the upshot there. And I think I'll just make one other comment and so for those of you who are interested in the book, the book is divided into three parts. Part one is launching local democracy, where I give you the background and the basic information and how this began, and even some historical precedent going back to the early part of the 19th century, 20th century during the Mashruta period. Part two is arguing for democracy, where these three groups, where I explicate the worldview and interests of each of these three groups, what they sought to do, what their assumptions were, what their goals were. Part three is I look at 4 areas in which there was contention over the fate of these local government institutions. One is elections, the ability to have free and fair contested elections. The second is city planning and the way in which local governments manage land use and land in their cities. The third was how the government system financed local governments. Did they have the money to do what they say they wanted it to do? And the fourth was a unique experiment that I was privileged to direct, which was a multi-year program in which we had an exchange program between almost 15 mayors from the Netherlands and Europe and 15 cities in Iran over a multi-year period in which we tried to, which we had an exchange. One delegation came to Iran, the EU came to Iran, the Iranians went to, we went to Europe, and there and that was an attempt to bring international resources around democratic ideas into Iran, but that also failed. So each of these 4 show how in these 4 areas, each time the reformists tried to push their agenda, they were blocked or they were outmaneuvered, let us say, by the regime. And then finally, I do speculate on what the future of local democracy is in Iran, but I think I should stop here and take questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We should all go out and buy the book. This is a lot of really exciting stuff here. So I'll open the floor up to questions. Anyone who'd like to ask a question, please catch my eye. As you ask your question, I ask you first just to introduce yourself.
I'm Iranian-born, Ali Zamaradi. Haven't been there for almost 50 years. My question is, do you see parallels between the way the central government uses these so-called local councils, between the way they've become instruments of central government in China versus Iran?
In general, I would say yes. I mean, I think the story I tell and the evolution I track is that at the beginning of this experiment, there was a belief that there was something unique about the local councils that would make them different from the elections that were being held at the national level, for example, for Majlis. And the point that was often made by the reformists was that because the candidates who were to stand for local elections were not going to be vetted by the Guardian Council, that they would be freer. I show that in practice this was not the case, and that over the 20-year period, what has happened is that the local councils have become absorbed very efficiently and effectively within the machinery of the Iranian political system. And so it's sort of converged with the national level. Yeah. And in terms of China, the differences with China is that China does not have elected local governments. They are all appointed. But they happen to be more effective in creating local economic development. the Iranian reforms overlooked that for reasons which I explain in the book.
Okay, our next question is from one of our postdocs, Milad Odaban.
Hi, I'm Milad, and I'm one of the postdocs at the center. Thank you very much. Two quick questions. I was wondering if you could speak about why the reformists fail and why the two other constituencies were able to succeed.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Yes, why the reformists failed and the two other constituencies succeeded. And I guess the second question is if you think that, since this is about democracy at some level, whether Iranian society is dividable into these three groups that you sort of outlined.
Yeah.
My sense is no, and if no, then what is the implication of that for the analysis?
Well, of course, I'd like to hear why you think they don't fit, but I will and I am interested in that. I wrote a paper which may interest you called "What Are Iranians Dreaming About?" It's a reflections on the Iranian Revolution at 40. And there I try to actually, I do make this tripartite distinction in a slightly different way. Let me take your first question first. Why did the reformers fail? I give several reasons. One of them is because I think they underestimated the degree of institutionalization of the Islamic Republic, the Islamic regime, very soon after 1979. One of the fascinating things I found in my research was how consistent the lawmakers within the Iranian parliament, even in the 1990s, were with the assumptions and goals which you find in the debates in creating the Constitution of 1979. I have a long section in the book in which I think for the first time I've gone very closely. I went through all the text, the transcripts of the debates of the 1979 Constitutional Assembly. Actually, I think I'm not mistaken, the longest time that was spent on any of the articles during the entire assembly was on the Shura. And I try to explain why that was the case. So one of the reasons I think the reformers failed is that they underestimated the degree to which a consolidated regime, okay, and I use regime here in a non-pejorative way, by the way political scientists use regime. It's a complex of formal and informal institutions that make up a political system. So I refer to as democratic regimes too. So I think they underestimated how early and how strongly the Islamic Republic of Iran had been consolidated. And you can use conceptually, you can use a concept, for example, like path dependency, which I refer to. Scholars like Mehran Kamravi have referred to this literature. You get institutions, you get built in. And it turns out the tracks on which new reforms were going to follow, the directions that were going to follow, you can find them pretty much in the early constitutional debates. In other words, even in 1995, 96, when Mr. Jannati makes a speech in Tehran University supporting the establishment of the Shura, you have to sit up, right? I mean, if this was such a reformist challenge to the regime, why would Jannati make and the reason is because he was articulating pretty much the same objectives as the Islamists had been making all the time. And just to give you an answer, their articulation is something that I call Islamic participatory governance. They support getting people out and being involved, but within the terms that the Islamists follow. And so I think that the reformers underestimated that. They underestimated also the significance of the fact that in the early days the Guardian Council would not vet local candidates. And then the final reason is they lost. Sometimes you fight and you lose. They were not strong enough. And as I noted, the backlash against the reformists had begun very early, earlier than I thought. So those are some of the reasons. And the three groups I'd like to, we'll take up later, if that's okay.
Our next question is from another postdoc, Shida.
My name is Shada Dayani. I'm a postdoc fellow here. My question is similar to Nilaz. I was wondering if you see fractions and forces within the reformists that helped their failure, or if you think that it was really forces from outside, mostly from the Jadalis and the technocrats, that caused this. But I'm really interested in how you see the reformers themselves and their differences.
Okay, I mean, to make a complicated story, just simple. The fact is that my research is very empirical, and as I say, I start from where things were. So, the group of reformists that were directly instrumental for implementing the reform in 1999, 1998, 1999, were what I call the avant-garde, the radical Muslim Democrats. That's what I refer to them as in the book. I refer to them as Muslim Democrats as opposed to Islamists or authoritarian Islamists. Those are the two groups. They consider, so it's a bit on the model of Ennahda in Tunisia. So that's what I'd say. So Musharakat and Mujahideen Inqilab, would be two parties that are the kind of avant-garde of the reformists. Do all the groups of the reformists support such bold actions? No, they don't. But they were in charge at the time. So Mostafa Tajzadeh was a deputy minister in charge of these at the time. Saeed Hajjarian was, at the presidential think tank, influencing policy. So their failure in the long term, I guess I don't point very directly to sort of factional infighting within the reformists. I think a much bigger issue is that they're just not strong enough. They're just not powerful enough. They just don't have enough support in society.
I want to stay mindful of time, but we have a question from a graduate student who is Nahid Hassan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Tajbakhsh, for this highly informative talk. I was wondering if you, in your book, also trace the impacts of the sanctions and how they have implications in terms of the sort of formation or creation of local democratization, or, state governments in general. I guess I'm curious to know whether you would go to that, because you said it's the last 20 years, right? So I assume there has to be some.
Yeah, the question of sanctions does not play a big role in my story. I didn't see it come up as an important thing. I mean, in the early 1990s, it was really the pressure of a reconstruction era in the post-war period. Sanctions had some impact on it, but sanctions had a sort of general impact in the sense of putting pressure on the government and government finances in trying to find efficient ways of organizing local economies. I mean, as an urbanist, you should know, a part of this has to do with the fact that cities are engines of economic growth. That's what China has proved. The backbone of Chinese economic miracle, the biggest miracle in the history of the world, was in fact their ability to harness and organize local governments to organize local resources. So that was like a big miss that the Iranians did. If they had learned from that, they could have actually, I think, made a more contribution. So, in the 20 years that I studied this, I didn't see the question of sanctions as playing an important role. I'm happy to take a few more if
if anyone has any final questions. If not, I can have my own, but yes, please, sir. Yeah.
Did financing play a role in the ability to influence the outcome?
Yes, that's an excellent question. As I noted here in chapter 8 of the book, I discuss the question of local finances. Essentially, once you give some authority or responsibility to a local government, the question is, do they have the money to do what they want to do and what their local residents want them to do? So my theory, actually that allows me to just go back just to show that, one of the animations, the animating, the motivations for me as an urbanist and as a comparative political analyst is the localist tradition and democratic theory. And so this part of the story of the book is something that we know internationally. This is a story of how it came to Iran and how it evolved. So financing is important because it has to do with what I define as, the real agenda of local democracy is the ability to create a constituency in a local area that has real demands of its local representatives, and that the representatives have the ability to respond. And that's what I trace, essentially. I mean, you can look around in your own cities. I mean, wherever we live. I live in New York City. I have the question is, how much democracy is there? Voting is one thing, engagement is another. And so I do look at that, and the answer I come up with is that there is a kind of, the way in which the financing is set up is not conducive to creating a constituency. In other words, giving people the sense. A lot of people will look at their local elected representatives and say, well, if they have no money to do anything, I mean, I'm not even going to bother doing. Of course, for us local political scientists, there's a huge conundrum about the localist tradition, which is that even in the West, and I study New York City too, New York City has a lot of money, it has a lot of power, and people still don't engage. I have a blog you can find on my website. I started a blog last summer called Tales of My Two Cities, and it tries to compare things in New York City and Tehran. And I looked at the elections last year in both cities. The turnout was about the same, 20% in New York City, and 20% in Tehran. And so I tried to see, well, the numbers on the surface are the same. Do they mean different things, and what do they mean? So I welcome you to look. So I'm just saying that even where there is finance, it's a complicated situation. But in Iran, yes, it's not set up to be conducive for people to be engaged in the way they want to.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tajbakhsh.
Thank you.